Fantasy stories are often defined by their magical worlds, grand adventures, and exploration of good and evil. But what about the characters? Not just the heroes and villains, but those at the edge of the story's focus. All the lives and people that make up the world, setting the stage for a fantastic story to take place. Some worlds feel like a set, a place for characters and plot to play out, while others feel endless, like a whole new world that doesn't stop existing when the main characters aren't around. Sometimes the difference between these two isn't determined by the primary or secondary characters, but by the third, tertiary characters, the people on the edge of our focus. Because when those characters feel real, it can make the world feel so full. Welcome to a running series called Exploring Frieren. My name is Pei, and today we're talking about when small characters make the world feel so big. World building is obviously a fundamental part of telling a fantasy story, specifically building a fantastic universe for the characters to explore. Even in its most simple cliché form, it consists of dragons and magic, knights and elves. But the further you step away from what's familiar, the more likely it is an audience might break immersion and get lost in the convoluted world that's being created. How do you walk that balance between grounded and magical? I think one of the best ways to do that is to introduce this fantastic world through the lens of relatable human experience. This is part of why I think isekai is so popular. It makes exposition way easier by giving the primary characters the same ignorance the audience has. The first part of the hero's journey is the ordinary world matched with a call to adventure. The simple farm boy finds a magical dragon's egg. The main character gets another chance at life in a magical world. Or a boy finds himself in the middle of a grand conflict between Jedi and Sith. When looking at world building, one of my favorite examples to dive into is the difference between the original Star Wars trilogy and Andor, both of which at one point were cutting edge for creating immersive worlds. I've never been much of a fan of Star Wars, but it did a lot of things right, innovating and blowing away its audience both in the grand nature of its story and the remarkable sets and special effects. But when Andor was released, there was this underlying feeling I had felt for a long time that I could finally identify. Star Wars is supposed to take place in this vast galaxy filled with different alien races and worlds, all with their own unique cultures. But somehow the universe felt so small. It felt like a beautifully set stage play, a space opera focused on the grand story of good and evil. But Andor felt the opposite, gritty and grounded, immersive and captivating in a way that I'd always wished Star Wars was. There's this scene where a couple characters have to hide from a TIE fighter as it flies by, and oh my god, the impact of that scene on Andor felt so much bigger than anything I'd ever seen in Star Wars. Which is crazy because the original Star Wars is built around the destruction of planets. But that impact felt undermined because all these planets and stories that we were introduced to always felt so sparse. I'm not actually arguing that one is inherently better than the other. To some degree, you have a limited amount of resources and time in any story, so there has to be compromises that are made. But the reason I find this comparison so interesting is because I heavily prefer Andor's world building over the original trilogy. Now, this all applies to Frieren, because it's not a traditional fantasy story. I think world building takes a backseat, especially in the beginning. But at a certain point that changes, and they start to really explore the world in a fascinating way, through the lens of all its small characters. A couple weeks ago, I started talking about Frieren's tournament arc and how it made changes that some people struggled with, but ultimately were very important. One of which is giving the audience more information about the world, and doing it in a way that's very consumable. There's this term I've been using a lot lately called hidden exposition. Exposition can be boring, heavy-handed, and intrusive, but it's something that all stories need. So, like a dog that refuses to take its medicine, there's ways you can sneak it into the yummy parts. Take for example Verbal, a character introduced during Frieren's mage exam. At first, he seems very simple, the classic masochistic edgelord. But something they tell you pretty early on, in a very straightforward manner, is that he grew up to be a soldier, specifically learning magic for the purpose of battle.
He's fought against the remnants of the Demon King's forces for years now.
And by telling us Verbal's backstory, we're actually shown a lot about the world. Verbal and his town grew up in a very volatile, dangerous place, demonstrating that even though the primary story in Frieren is supposed to take place during an era of peace, that the further north you go, the more dangerous it gets, with the remnants of the Demon King's presence still littered about. When he tells Ubel that he's killed before, even fighting armies of children, you find out that there are ruthless warlords, humans just as bad as demons in the north, showing A by telling B. And the strategy is present throughout most of the mage exam. All the side characters are giving us more information about the world, making it feel a lot bigger through inference. And all of that exposition is being paired with these characters as very real threats to our protagonists. And, more importantly, they're fun, engaging characters. To make hidden exposition work, you need it attached to something that's actually pretty engaging, and I find Verbal's character really interesting. He's described by Frieren in the manga as a guy that looks like he'd kick a dog. While presented as a grumpy, masochistic edgelord, he also is kind. And despite his brutal history, he's doing a lot to try to hold on to those components of what make him feel human, demonstrated in his inability to just kill Ubel without preparing himself. This depth also doesn't just end with Verbal. There are two young mages that are paired with Frieren in the first part of the mage exam that are very practical, Lavina and Kane. They're obviously introduced as an attempt at comedic relief, and they force Frieren into a leadership position. But they also give us more information we can infer about Frieren's world. They're both graduates of a prestigious magic university. Lavina has older brothers succeeding in politics. These characters imply a world beyond what we've seen in the past. They're small components of a much larger story that expand it greatly. Frieren, in the first half of its story, is very focused. Magic is this huge central theme in the story, yet despite that, Frieren's party rarely interacts with other mages, until the exam. Across their adventures, their party's only shown interacting with one elf, two dwarves, and a couple demons. It's a very limited story despite their constant exploration. That's why, as I've analyzed more and more of the tournament arc, I've really grown to love the tertiary characters. Their impact and what they're setting up is more obvious in retrospect, but it is noticeable. 2 weeks ago, I created an entire video dedicated to Denkin, one of the fan favorite tertiary characters. And last week I talked about Ubel's impact on the magic system, but I didn't have an opportunity to talk about her interesting dynamic with Land. They're a perfect example of just how much these side characters can sometimes capture the audience's attention. An engaging odd couple that ends up spending tons of time next to one another. And as the story went on, both characters on their own would have been fascinating, but together, their dynamic is even better. Good character dynamics go from feeling like addition to multiplication, but Ubel and Land weren't the only pair that I felt had this chemistry. There are other great examples, like Denkin playing grandfather for Richter and Laufen. Seeing all these characters between the tournament, when juxtaposed to them when they were at conflict with one another just the day before, it works surprisingly well. These dynamics are constantly feeding us little bits of exposition, but they're also just entertaining. A weird set of characters all finding charm in their own ways. I argued in my Denkin video 2 weeks ago that tertiary characters, which I referred to as periphery characters, had to satisfy one of two goals. They have to be practical or entertaining, sometimes both, because any time spent away from the primary cast has a high chance of backfiring. And Frieren's mage exam is filled with both practical and entertaining characters, especially when placed in interesting pairings, showing us the grand nature of Frieren's world, all based off the audience's ability to infer about the things that we're told about them. It's a fun, fascinating way to build a world, one that's hard to fully appreciate unless you look closely.